The Zephyrian Galactic Council was dying, and they knew it. Picture this. 3 months ago, they controlled over 400 star systems. Today, less than half that number remained, and the count was dropping fast. The Void Swarm had already devoured half their territory, and these weren't your typical space bugs that you could just blast away with regular weapons. We're talking about something far worse. These parasitic entities moved like a plague across the galaxy, stripping entire star systems bare. They didn't just destroy planets. They converted them. Imagine watching your home world get consumed by these creatures, then seeing it transformed into a massive, living hive ship that just kept growing bigger and more dangerous. That's what the Zephyrians were facing every single day. Council Prime Minister Vexterra hadn't slept properly in weeks. Every morning brought new reports of lost colonies, evacuated systems, and military fleets that simply vanished without a trace. The swarm moved faster than their best ships could retreat. It adapted to every weapon they threw at it. Worse still, it seemed to be learning from each encounter, getting smarter and more efficient with every system it consumed. The emergency council meetings had become daily affairs. Military commanders with decades of experience looked lost and defeated. Scientists who had spent their entire careers studying warfare admitted they had no solutions. The greatest minds in Zephyrian space were stumped, and time was running out fast. That's when Vexterra found himself staring at classified files that hadn't been opened in over 2 centuries. The archive room deep beneath the Capitol building held secrets that most current council members didn't even know existed. Buried among reports of ancient conflicts and forgotten treaties was a single folder marked with symbols that made his skin crawl. Earth, Sol 3, a little blue planet in a quarantine sector. The warnings plastered across the file were enough to make even seasoned military commanders nervous. Death World species. Extreme caution advised. Contact prohibited. But it wasn't just the official warnings that worried him. It was the personal notes scribbled in the margins by previous council members. Notes that spoke of creatures so dangerous that the entire galaxy had agreed to leave them alone. The humans had been quarantined for good reason. 300 years ago, the first contact team that encountered them had returned with stories that sounded impossible. They spoke of beings that thrive in conditions that would kill most galactic species within minutes. Creatures that turned warfare into an art form, who seemed to find joy in the most dangerous situations imaginable. But here's what really scared the early explorers. Humans didn't just survive on their death world, they dominated it. They had conquered every environment on their planet, from frozen wastelands to scorching deserts, from the deepest oceans to the highest mountains. They had even begun reaching out to other worlds in their system, treating the vacuum of space like it was just another challenge to overcome. The galactic community had made a collective decision back then. These humans were too dangerous, too unpredictable, too violent to be allowed into civilized space. The quarantine zone around their system was established, and for 3 centuries it had held. No contact, no communication, no exceptions. But desperate times call for desperate measures. The swarm was now just 3 systems away from their capital world. Vexterra could see the evacuation ships launching from his office window. Millions of Zephyrians were fleeing their homes, carrying nothing but what they could grab in a few minutes. Children separated from their parents in the chaos. Families torn apart by a terror they couldn't fight. The military briefings were getting worse every day. Admiral Kexthen, their top commander, had delivered the final assessment that morning. At current rates of expansion, we have maybe 2 weeks before the swarm reaches our capital. Our remaining fleets can't stop them. Nothing we have can stop them. 2 weeks. That's all the time the Zephyrian civilization had left. Vexterra made the decision that would change everything. Despite every instinct screaming against it, despite 3 centuries of protocols forbidding contact, he authorized a transmission. It was a simple message, broadcast toward the quarantined Sol system using emergency frequencies that hopefully someone would be monitoring. The message was simple and direct. We need your help. Please. He expected to wait days for a response, if one came at all. Maybe the humans had wiped themselves out. Maybe they'd evolved beyond caring about other species. Maybe they'd simply ignore the plea from strangers who had avoided them for centuries. Earth's response came back within hours. faster than should have been possible across that distance. The message was cold, mechanical, delivered without any warmth or curiosity about who was asking for help. Request acknowledged. Fleet deployment authorized. ETA 72 standard hours. No questions asked. No demand for payment or explanations. Just a simple confirmation that help was coming. That should have been their first warning that they had no idea what they just unleashed upon the galaxy. Admiral Wesley Harper's fleet didn't look like much when it arrived at the edge of Zephyrian space. 12 ships total, sleek and compact, each one roughly the size of a standard galactic cruiser. Compared to the massive Zephyrian battleships that stretched for kilometers, these human vessels looked almost fragile. But it wasn't the size that caught everyone's attention. It was how they moved. The human ships glided through space with precision that seemed impossible. No wasted energy, no unnecessary course corrections, just smooth, calculated movements that suggested a level of technology the Zephyrians had never seen before. But even then, 12 ships against what was coming seemed like a hopeless gesture. The Void Swarm's advanced force was already visible on long-range sensors. 3 massive biovessels, each one the size of a small moon, accompanied by dozens of smaller attack craft that were still larger than most Zephyrian warships. These weren't just ships. They were living creatures, grown rather than built, with hulls that could regenerate damage and weapons that adapted to whatever they faced. Vex Terra stood in the observation deck of the Orbital Defense Station, surrounded by his military advisors and what remained of the Galactic Council. They had gathered to witness what they assumed would be humanity's heroic last stand. The humans had come to help, just as they promised. But everyone knew it was too little, too late. Still, it was something. At least they wouldn't face annihilation alone. The Swarm's largest biovessel, a nightmare of organic architecture that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, began accelerating toward the human formation. Its surface was covered in weapon pods that looked like massive eyes, each one capable of firing energy bursts that could crack a planet's crust. The smaller attack craft spread out in a hunting formation that the Swarm had perfected over countless battles. The Zephyrians expected to watch humanity's noble sacrifice unfold. They prepared themselves to witness brave human crews making their final stand against impossible odds. Some of the younger council members actually started preparing memorial speeches to honor these strangers who had traveled across the galaxy to help them. They weren't prepared for what happened next. The humans didn't retreat. They didn't even seem concerned. If anything, the radio chatter from the human fleet suggested they were treating this like just another day at the office. Admiral Harper's calm voice cut through the communication static. All units, weapons free. Remember, we need samples, so try to keep some of the bigger pieces intact. Samples? The Zephyrians looked at each other in confusion. What did he mean by samples? Harper's flagship, the U.S. Relentless, positioned itself directly in the path of the largest hive ship. For a moment, it looked like the ultimate act of courage. A single human vessel standing against a moon-sized monster. Then the Relentless opened fire with weapons that shouldn't have existed. The first salvo wasn't energy beams or plasma bolts like everyone expected. Instead, the humans launched what looked like simple torpedoes. But these weren't ordinary missiles. Each one contained something that made the laws of physics cry. Singularity torpedoes that created miniature black holes, each one lasting just long enough to tear through the Swarm's supposedly impenetrable carapace like it was made of paper. The massive biovessel's screech of pain echoed across every frequency as sections of its hull simply disappeared into the artificial black holes. But the humans weren't done. The next wave of weapons defied everything the Zephyrians thought they knew about technology. Quantum disruptors fired invisible beams that literally unraveled matter at the molecular level. Wherever these beams touched the Swarm vessels, the organic hulls just fell apart, dissolving into their basic components. It wasn't destruction, it was complete molecular breakdown. But the most terrifying thing came next. The humans deployed clouds of what looked like metallic dust, millions of microscopic machines that swarmed over the damaged Swarm vessels like hungry insects. These self-replicating nanobots didn't just attack the enemy ships. They began converting Swarm biomass into human military assets in real time. The The Zephyrians watched their sensors in stunned silence as something impossible happened before their eyes. The human ships started growing bigger, stronger, deadlier with every passing minute. Additional weapon systems sprouted from their hulls. Armor plating thickened. New engine modules appeared, as if they were being grown rather than built. The nanobots were literally eating the swarm ships and using material to upgrade the human fleet. It was like watching a pack of wolves not just hunt their prey, but somehow become stronger and more dangerous by consuming it. Within 30 minutes of the battle starting, the human fleet had doubled in size. The swarm's moon-sized biovessel was now a hollow shell, its mass redistributed among 12 human ships that transformed into something that looked more like spaceborne predators than military vessels. Admiral Harper's voice came over the communications again, still perfectly calm. Phase 1 complete. Beginning harvesting operations. Science teams, prepare for specimen collection. The Zephyrians realized with growing horror that this hadn't been a desperate battle for survival. For the humans, this had been farming. It wasn't a battle, it was a dissection. The Zephyrians had witnessed countless military engagements over the centuries, from desperate last stands to calculated strategic strikes. But they had never seen anything like this. The humans fought like they were conducting a scientific experiment, which, as it turned out, they were. Every weapon they fired seemed perfectly calibrated to exploit weaknesses in swarm biology that they shouldn't have known about. The swarm had been terrorizing the galaxy for months, adapting to every defensive strategy the various species threw at them. Their bio-armor had proven resistant to energy weapons, their neural networks had evolved past standard disruption tactics, and their regenerative capabilities made them nearly impossible to permanently damage. But the humans? They bypassed every single adaptation, like they had the swarm's complete biological blueprint sitting on their desks. When the swarm's outer carapace proved resistant to standard plasma fire, the humans switched to resonance weapons that vibrated at exactly the frequency needed to shatter the organic compounds. When the creatures tried to regenerate damage, human targeting systems immediately identified and struck the specific nerve clusters that controlled the healing process. It was surgical precision on a massive scale, and it terrified the watching Zephyrians more than the swarm ever had. But the real shock came when the humans decided to board the partially disabled hive ships. Commander Bridget Stone's voice crackled over the communication channels as she organized the boarding parties. "All right, people, remember we want live specimens. Try not to damage anything we can study later." Her Marines looked like something out of a nightmare as they approached the swarm vessels. Each one wore powered exoskeletons that made them look more like walking tanks than soldiers. These weren't the bulky, slow-moving armor suits that other galactic militaries used. Human exoskeletons move with fluid grace, amplifying their natural agility while providing protection that could withstand direct hits from swarm bioweapons. The Zephyrians watched through drone cameras as Stone's team cut through the hive ship's hull, like it was made of soft metal. Their tools weren't standard military equipment either. They carried weapons that seemed to phase through swarm armor completely, striking directly at the vulnerable tissue underneath. Electromagnetic grenades that shut down the aliens' neural networks like flipping a light switch. Sonic disruptors that could paralyze entire sections of the living ships without causing permanent damage. But here's what really terrified the Zephyrians as they monitored the operation. The humans were smiling. You could hear it in their voices, even when you couldn't see their faces through the helmet displays. Radio chatter from human units was filled with jokes, tactical discussions, and what could only be described as pure enthusiasm. "Hey, Stone, check out this neural cluster over here," came one voice. "It's like they've got a backup brain system. That's actually pretty clever. Copy that, Rodriguez. Mark it for extraction. The biotech guys are going to love this." Anyone else notice how their defensive secretions change color based on threat assessment? That's fascinating stuff right there. These Death Worlders weren't just winning. They were having fun. They talked about the swarm's biological adaptations like other people might discuss an interesting puzzle or a challenging video game. The same creatures that had sent entire galactic civilizations fleeing in terror were being treated like specimens in a lab experiment. Dr. Preston Walsh, the fleet's chief xenobiologist, was already publishing research papers on swarm physiology before the battle was even over. His reports were being transmitted back to Earth in real time, complete with detailed biological scans and tactical assessments. Fascinating adaptation mechanisms, he noted in his field reports, his voice filled with genuine scientific excitement. The way they've integrated quantum-level cellular regeneration with macro-scale structural flexibility is remarkable. We'll definitely be keeping samples for extended study. The way he said samples made it clear he wasn't talking about small tissue fragments. He was talking about keeping entire sections of the hive's ships, possibly including living swarm entities, for research purposes. Vexterra found himself gripping the observation deck railing so hard his knuckles had turned white. Around him, other council members stood in stunned silence as they watched the humans work through the interior of the hive ship like tourists exploring an interesting museum exhibit. "Sir," whispered Admiral Kexon, his voice barely audible, "they're not just fighting the swarm. They're studying them, learning from them, and they're enjoying every minute of it." The Admiral's words hung in the air like a death sentence. The Zephyrians were beginning to understand that they hadn't called for rescue. They had called for something far more dangerous than the swarm could ever be. On the main display, Commander Stone's team had reached what appeared to be the hive ship's central command center. Instead of destroying it, they were carefully mapping its biological components, taking measurements, collecting samples, and documenting everything with the methodical thoroughness of scientists who had all the time in the world. "Beautiful work," Stone commented as she examined the pulsing organic control interface. "Whoever designed this really knew what they were doing. I bet our engineers can improve on this design." Improve on it? The humans weren't just defeating the galaxy's greatest threat. They were preparing to make it better. The Void Swarm tried to retreat. For the first time in their recorded history, these galactic predators that had consumed countless civilizations decided they'd bitten off more than they could chew. The remaining hive ships, now barely half their original size after the human nanobots had stripped away massive sections of biomass, began pulling back from the battlefield. Their retreat wasn't chaotic or panicked like you might expect from a defeated enemy. The swarm moved with the same calculated efficiency they'd shown throughout their expansion across the galaxy. Bioships formed defensive formations. Smaller attack craft provided cover, and they began to withdraw using the same tactics that had allowed them to dominate space for so long. But they had made one critical error in judgment. They assumed the humans would let them go. Admiral Harper's response was swift and merciless. Negative. No survivors. His voice carried across the communication channels with the same calm professionalism he'd maintained throughout the entire engagement. But there was something else now, a cold finality that made every Zephyrian listening feel a chill run down their spine. The human fleet immediately shifted into pursuit mode. But this wasn't like any chase the Zephyrians had ever witnessed. Human ships moved through space with an efficiency that seemed to ignore basic physics. They didn't just follow the swarm's retreat path. They predicted it, cutting off escape routes and herding the bioships like a pack of predators driving prey toward a trap. But the real shock came when the humans revealed capabilities that nobody knew existed. Deep space hunter vessels emerged from what appeared to be empty space, ships that had been somehow concealed beyond the range of even the most advanced sensors. These weren't the compact cruisers that had first arrived to help the Zephyrians. These were something entirely different. The hunter ships moved like living things, adapting their configuration mid-flight to match whatever challenge they faced. When swarm bioships tried to dive into the gravity well of a nearby star to escape, the human hunters simply reconfigured themselves for a high-gravity pursuit. When the aliens attempted to hide in asteroid fields, the human vessels split apart into smaller units that could navigate the debris with ease. Tracking technology that the Zephyrians couldn't even begin to understand allowed the humans to follow the swarm's retreat beyond Zephyrian territory, across neutral space, and into regions of the galaxy that no galactic civilization had ever explored. The fleeing bioships left quantum signatures, bioenergy trails, and microscopic traces that the humans read like a roadmap, leading directly back to the swarm's home territory. The pursuit lasted 18 hours. 18 hours of relentless, methodical hunting that covered thousands of light years and crossed into what the star charts marked as unknown territory, approach not advised. The Zephyrians could only follow the chase through long-range sensor data, watching in fascination, and growing horror as the humans tracked their quarry across the void. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Within 48 hours, massive human world ships, vessels the size of small moons that nobody knew existed, arrived at the swarm's origin point. These weren't military ships in any conventional sense. They were mobile civilizations, complete ecosystems capable of supporting millions of humans while serving as manufacturing centers, research facilities, and military bases all rolled into one. The world ships had emerged from deeper space, from directions that suggested they'd been traveling for far longer than the 3 days since Earth had received the Zephyrians' call for help. This hadn't been a rescue mission hastily organized in response to an emergency. This had been a planned operation, part of something much larger and more coordinated than anyone had realized. What they found at the swarm's origin point defied imagination. A completely dead galaxy, stripped of all life and resources. Billions of stars reduced to dim red dwarfs, their energy harvested. Countless worlds ground down to their core materials. Entire solar systems converted into the raw materials needed to build more hive ships and support the swarm's expansion. But the humans didn't just finish off the remaining swarm presence scattered throughout the dead galaxy. They started rebuilding, using hybrid human swarm technology that they'd apparently developed during the brief battle at Zephyrian space. They began constructing what they called reclamation facilities throughout the lifeless star systems. These weren't simple military outposts or research stations. The Zephyrians watched through long-range scanners as the humans began the systematic restoration of entire worlds, using technology that combined their own advanced capabilities with adapted swarm biotechnology. Dead planets were being re-terraformed. Stripped solar systems were having their energy output restored and enhanced. The humans were claiming an entire galaxy for themselves. Harper's final report to the Galactic Council was delivered with the same cold professionalism they'd shown from day one. Primary objective completed. Swarm threat eliminated. Secondary objectives authorized. Integration protocols now active. Territorial claims have been established in accordance with standard Earth colonial administration procedures. Earth colonial administration. The word sent a chill through every Zephyrian who heard them. The humans hadn't just defeated the swarm. They'd been preparing for galactic expansion long before anyone had called them for help. Vexterra stared at the communication display, finally understanding the full scope of what they'd done. They hadn't called for rescue. They'd given humanity the perfect excuse to reveal capabilities that had been hidden for centuries and claim territory that no galactic power could possibly challenge. The Zephyrians were starting to realize they'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. 6 months later, the galaxy looked very different. The star charts that had remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years now showed something that would have been unthinkable just half a year ago. Vast sections of space that once belonged to dozens of independent civilizations were now marked with a single color, human blue. Humanity had established what they politely called Terran Protectorate zones around 73 star systems, and the number was growing every week. The process was always the same, and it was always presented as an incredible opportunity, rather than what it actually was. Human diplomatic ships would arrive at the edge of a system, broadcasting on all frequencies with offers that seemed almost too good to be true. Advanced technology that was centuries ahead of anything the galaxy had seen. Military protection that guaranteed no species would ever again face threats like the Void Swarm. Economic partnerships that promised prosperity beyond imagination. The demonstrations were always spectacular. Human representatives would arrive with samples of their technology, medical devices that could cure diseases thought incurable, energy systems that could power entire worlds with clean, unlimited energy, defensive systems that could protect planets from any conceivable threat. They would set up these demonstrations right there in orbit, showing local governments exactly what they could have if they just signed a simple agreement. The agreements themselves seemed reasonable at first glance. Standard partnership documents that guaranteed mutual cooperation, shared resources, and collective defense. Most species that reviewed them found nothing obviously threatening in the language. The terms were generous. The benefits were real, and the humans seemed genuinely interested in peaceful cooperation. But there was always a catch hidden in the fine print. Once a species signed the agreement, they discovered that Mutual cooperation meant following human guidelines on everything from industrial development to military deployment. Shared resources meant that humans got access to local materials and strategic locations whenever they deemed it necessary. Collective defense meant that human military forces would be permanently stationed in the system, with complete authority over security decisions. Still, many species signed willingly. The technology alone was worth the trade-offs, and after seeing what humans had done to the Void Swarm, having them as allies seemed like the smartest possible decision. Who wouldn't want the protection of beings capable of converting galactic predators into raw materials? But species that declined their generous offers? Well, they started experiencing unfortunate technical difficulties. It always began small. Supply chains that had operated smoothly for decades would suddenly develop mysterious disruptions. Cargo ships would experience navigation failures in previously safe routes. Communication networks that connected different worlds would start experiencing interference that no one could trace or fix. The problems would escalate gradually. Defensive systems would mysteriously malfunction during routine maintenance. Industrial facilities would suffer power failures that somehow affected only the most critical systems. Banking networks would experience glitches that froze financial transactions at the worst possible moments. None of these problems could be directly traced back to human intervention. There was never any evidence of sabotage or direct attack. But somehow, species that remained outside the Terran Protectorate found their civilizations slowly grinding to a halt while their neighbors who had signed agreements with humanity thrived like never before. The message was clear without ever being stated directly. Join willingly, or watch your society collapse under the weight of inexplicable technical failures. The quarantine zone around Earth had expanded to encompass nearly half the known galaxy. What had once been a small, restricted area around a single star system was now a massive sphere of influence that included hundreds of worlds, countless trade routes, and the majority of the galaxy's industrial capacity. Prime Minister Vexterra sat in the emergency council session, staring at territorial maps that showed the true scope of human expansion. The holographic display painted a picture that was both beautiful and terrifying. Vast swaths of space marked in human blue, connected by trade routes and communication networks that all led back to Earth. The reports from across the galaxy were all the same. Overwhelming human technological superiority that made resistance pointless. Aggressive expansion disguised as peaceful cooperation. Species after species joined the Protectorate, some voluntarily attracted by the obvious benefits, others gradually coerced by the mysterious technical problems that plagued independent worlds. But what truly terrified Vexterra wasn't the scope of human expansion. It was the efficiency of it. Humans had managed to gain control of half the galaxy without firing a single shot in anger after that first battle with the Swarm. They had simply made themselves indispensable while making independence impossible. The other council members sat around a table, their faces reflecting the same horrified realization he'd come to weeks ago. They had created the situation. Their desperate call for help had given humanity the perfect excuse to reveal capabilities that had obviously been developed over centuries of secret preparation. The humans hadn't been isolated in their quarantine zone. They had been preparing, building world ships, developing technologies that surpassed anything in galactic space, and waiting for the perfect opportunity to expand beyond their single star system. He looked up at his fellow council members, seeing his own fear reflected in their expressions. Admiral Kex, then, who had once commanded fleets across dozens of systems, now looked like a broken old man. Science Minister Tilandra, who had spent her career studying advanced technologies, sat staring at reports of human innovations that made her life's work seem primitive. "We called him to save us from monsters," Vexterra said quietly, his voice barely carrying across the silent chamber. "We never stopped to consider that maybe we were just calling bigger monsters to deal with the small ones. The age of human dominance had begun, and it was already far too late to stop it. The galaxy belonged to humanity now, and every species in it was learning to live under their protection, whether they wanted it or not.